The marble fountain in the corporate courtyard erupted in chaos as the golden retriever collapsed mid-stride. Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics, watched in horror as her beloved companion Luna suddenly stiffened, her legs buckling beneath her like a marionette with severed strings. The dog's eyes rolled back, revealing only whites, while violent tremors racked her muscular frame. "Luna," Victoria's voice cracked with panic as she dropped to her knees beside the convulsing animal. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Her perfectly tailored navy suit absorbed the fountain spray as she reached for her pet, hands trembling with helplessness. The quarterly board meeting she'd been rushing to suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the sight of Luna's labored breathing. Around them, executives scattered like startled birds. Some fumbled for their phones, others backed away in uncomfortable silence. The pristine corporate environment, designed to project strength and control, felt utterly inadequate in the face of raw, animalistic distress. From the edge of the courtyard, where manicured hedges met the building's shadow, Marcus Rodriguez watched the scene unfold. His weathered hands gripped the handles of his wheelbarrow, filled with mulch that suddenly seemed trivial. He'd been working these grounds for 3 years, invisible to most who passed by, but Luna had always been different. She'd greet him each morning with enthusiastic tail wags, accepting the gentle scratches behind her ears that he offered during his rounds. Now, as Victoria cradled the seizing dog, Marcus noticed something others missed. Luna's gums, normally a healthy pink, had taken on a distinctive blue-gray tint. Her breathing pattern wasn't random either. There was a rhythm to it, a specific cadence that triggered a memory from another life, another time when he'd worn scrubs instead of work boots. The morning had started like any other at Sterling Dynamics corporate headquarters. Marcus Rodriguez arrived at dawn, just as he had every weekday for the past 3 years. The security guard, a kind man named Pete, waved him through the gates with a familiar nod. To most employees rushing past with their coffee cups and briefcases, Marcus was simply part of the landscape, as unremarkable as the carefully pruned oak trees he tended. But Marcus carried secrets in his calloused hands, secrets that whispered of a different life, when those same hands had once performed delicate surgeries on creatures no bigger than his thumb. When he'd held the title of doctor, when his name had appeared on research papers about avian neurological disorders, when colleagues had sought his opinion rather than avoiding eye contact altogether. That was before Emma died, before 8-year-old Sophia became his entire world, before grief and single parenthood forced him to abandon veterinary school with only 6 months left until graduation. Now, Sophia was 12, and Marcus had learned to find peace in the simple rhythm of maintaining living things, even if they were plants instead of patients. The Sterling Dynamics campus sprawled across 40 acres of meticulously landscaped property. Glass towers reached toward the sky like crystalline monuments to corporate success, while below, Marcus cultivated gardens that softened the harsh edges of steel and concrete. He knew every inch of this place, from the drainage patterns that flooded the north parking lot during heavy rains, to the specific fertilizer blend that kept the executive lawn that perfect shade of emerald green. Victoria Sterling had inherited the company from her father 5 years ago, transforming Sterling Dynamics from a regional insurance firm into a national powerhouse. At 38, she commanded respect in boardrooms across the country, her sharp intellect and unwavering determination earning her recognition in business magazines and industry publications. But to Marcus, she was simply the woman who brought her dog to work every day, who sometimes sat alone on the courtyard bench during lunch breaks, absently throwing a tennis ball while Luna bounded after it with infectious joy. Luna had been Victoria's constant companion for 6 years, adopted as a puppy during Victoria's messy divorce from real estate mogul James Hamilton. The dog represented stability in Victoria's otherwise turbulent personal life, a source of unconditional love that demanded nothing more than daily walks and the occasional treat. Victoria often joked to her assistant that Luna was the only employee who never asked for raises or complained about working conditions. Marcus had first noticed the subtle changes in Luna's behavior 3 weeks ago. As the groundskeeper responsible for the courtyard's maintenance, he observed the natural rhythms of the space more closely than anyone else. Luna's morning routine typically included energetic exploration of every corner, investigating new scents with the methodical precision of a canine detective. But lately her movements had become less enthusiastic, more mechanical. The changes were subtle enough that Victoria, consumed by merger negotiations and quarterly projections, hadn't noticed. But Marcus saw everything. He watched Luna hesitate before jumping onto her favorite bench, noticed how she'd sometimes stop mid-stride as if confused about her destination. Her coat, once lustrous and thick, had developed a dull quality that spoke of internal distress. Most telling were Luna's eyes. Marcus had spent years studying animal behavior, learning to read the subtle communications that passed between species. Luna's gaze had lost its sharp focus, replaced by something that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of the neurological cases he'd studied during his residency. Cases involving degenerative conditions that attacked the nervous system with surgical precision. 3 days before Luna's collapse, Marcus had found himself lingering near the courtyard during Victoria's lunch break. He watched as Luna attempted to catch a tennis ball, her coordination noticeably off. The dog's head movements seemed delayed, her responses to Victoria's commands sluggish. When Victoria threw the ball toward the fountain, Luna started in the wrong direction entirely before correcting course. "She's getting older," Victoria had murmured to herself, a note of sadness in her voice. "Maybe I should cut back on these play sessions." Marcus had wanted to speak up then, to suggest that Luna's behavior might indicate something more serious than simple aging. But what authority did a groundskeeper have to contradict a CEO's assessment of her own pet? The social hierarchy that governed corporate spaces created invisible barriers as effective as any physical wall. Instead, Marcus had returned to his work, pulling weeds from the herb garden with unnecessary force, while frustration built in his chest. He'd forgotten how isolating it felt to possess knowledge that others desperately needed, but wouldn't accept because of who he was rather than what he knew. That evening, after picking up Sophia from her after-school program, Marcus had found himself describing Luna's symptoms over dinner. Sophia, wise beyond her 12 years and accustomed to her father's unusual interests, listened with the serious attention she reserved for matters of genuine importance. "It sounds like that bird you told me about," Sophia said, twirling spaghetti around her fork with practiced ease. "The one with the brain thing that made it fly into walls." Marcus paused, his own fork halfway to his mouth. Sophia was referring to a case study he'd shared months ago about a crow exhibiting neurological symptoms caused by a rare parasitic infection. The parallel hadn't occurred to him before, but now it seemed glaringly obvious. Both cases involved progressive motor dysfunction, disorientation, and gradual behavioral changes. "You're right," Marcus said slowly, his mind already racing through differential diagnoses. "It does sound similar. Are you going to help her?" Sophia asked with the directness that made Marcus simultaneously proud and terrified of raising such a perceptive child. "I don't know if I can," Marcus admitted. "Sometimes people don't listen when help comes from unexpected places." Sophia considered this with the gravity of someone who'd learned early that life rarely followed fairy tales. "Maybe they don't listen because they're scared," she suggested. "Or maybe because they think they already know everything." Her insight struck Marcus with unexpected force. In his years as a veterinary student, he'd encountered both scenarios countless times. Pet owners who refused treatment recommendations because they conflicted with preconceived notions, colleagues who dismissed alternative diagnoses because they threatened professional egos. The medical field, for all its emphasis on evidence-based practice, remained surprisingly susceptible to human psychology. The night before Luna's collapse, Marcus had stayed late at the campus, ostensibly to finish installing new irrigation lines near the main building. In reality, he'd been hoping to observe Luna during her evening walk with Victoria. The CEO typically took Luna for a final outing around 8 o'clock, after most employees had departed for the day. Marcus positioned himself near the tool shed, partially concealed by a massive rhododendron that he'd been training to grow along the building's eastern wall. From this vantage point, he could observe without intruding, maintaining the invisible status that his job required while satisfying his growing concern for Luna's welfare. Victoria emerged from the building at precisely 8:15, Luna trailing behind on a leather leash that probably cost more than Marcus earned in a week. The contrast between them was stark yet somehow harmonious. Victoria in her crisp business attire, Luna in her natural golden coat that caught the evening light like spun copper. But tonight, Luna's movements confirmed Marcus's worst fears. The dog stumbled twice while navigating the familiar path around the courtyard, her head tilted at an odd angle, as if she were trying to hear something just beyond her range of perception. Most disturbing was the way Luna kept turning in circles, a repetitive behavior that suggested neurological dysfunction rather than simple confusion. Victoria, absorbed in a phone conversation about international shipping regulations, remained oblivious to her companion's distress. She walked at her usual brisk pace, expecting Luna to keep up as she always had. When Luna lagged behind, Victoria simply tugged gently on the leash, her attention still focused on quarterly profit margins, rather than the creature who depended on her for everything. Marcus watched this scene with growing alarm. Every instinct he'd developed during his veterinary training screamed that Luna was exhibiting classic symptoms of a serious neurological condition. The progressive nature of her deterioration, combined with the specific pattern of motor dysfunction, pointed towards several possible diagnoses, none of them minor. He thought about Sophia's question, "Are you going to help her?" The answer should have been simple. He possessed knowledge that could potentially save Luna's life, or at least improve her quality of life through appropriate medical intervention. But the complexity of his situation made any action fraught with risk. As a groundskeeper, Marcus existed in a carefully defined role that didn't include offering medical advice to his employer's pet. Overstepping those boundaries could cost him his job, and losing this position would mean losing the health insurance that covered Sophia's asthma medications. It would mean explaining to his daughter why they had to move again, why her father's inability to stay silent had disrupted their carefully rebuilt life. Yet watching Luna struggle to coordinate her movements while Victoria remained unaware felt like a betrayal of everything Marcus had once sworn to uphold. The veterinary oath he'd never officially taken still echoed in his memory, to use his knowledge and skills for the benefit of society, through the protection of animal health and welfare. The internal conflict followed Marcus home that night, making sleep elusive despite his physical exhaustion. He lay in bed listening to Sophia's steady breathing from the room next door, wondering if there was a way to help Luna without destroying the stability he'd worked so hard to build for his daughter. Morning brought no easy answers, only the familiar routine of preparing Sophia's lunch and driving her to school before heading to work. The campus looked the same as always, impressive architecture framed by perfectly maintained landscaping, early arriving employees hurrying toward another day of corporate achievement. But Marcus felt the weight of knowledge pressing against his chest like a physical burden. He was replacing the seasonal flowers in the planters near the main entrance when Victoria's sleek black sedan pulled into her reserved parking space. Luna emerged from the passenger seat with noticeable difficulty, her usual graceful exit replaced by an awkward scramble that required several attempts. Victoria, already checking messages on her phone, didn't notice Luna's struggle. She clipped the leash to Luna's collar with practiced efficiency and headed toward the building, expecting her companion to follow. Luna tried to comply, but her gait had developed an unmistakable tremor, a fine shaking that suggested her nervous system was struggling to coordinate basic motor functions. Marcus abandoned his planting and followed at a discreet distance, his trained eye cataloging every symptom.
Luna's head tilt had become more pronounced overnight. Her pupils appeared dilated despite the morning sunlight. Most concerning was the way she kept turning in tight circles, a behavior pattern that in Marcus's experience indicated increased intracranial pressure. The morning proceeded with agonizing normalcy. Victoria disappeared into her climate-controlled office for back-to-back meetings, while Luna remained in the courtyard as she did every day. But instead of her usual exploratory wandering, Luna stood motionless near the fountain, her body swaying slightly, as if she was struggling to maintain balance. Marcus tried to focus on his scheduled tasks, but found himself glancing toward Luna every few minutes. Other employees passed by without seeming to notice anything unusual about the dog's behavior. To them, Luna was simply part of the scenery, as familiar and unremarkable as the bronze sculpture near the building's entrance. By mid-morning, Luna's condition had visibly worsened. She'd begun walking in increasingly tight circles, a repetitive motion that made Marcus's stomach clench with recognition. He'd seen this behavior pattern before, during his clinical rotations at the veterinary college. It was called circling, and it indicated serious brain dysfunction that required immediate medical intervention. Marcus made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He approached the security desk where Pete sat reading a newspaper between monitoring the surveillance screens. "Pete," Marcus said, keeping his voice casual despite the urgency he felt, "has anyone mentioned that Luna seems a bit off lately?" Pete looked up from his paper, genuinely surprised by the question. In 3 years, Marcus had rarely initiated conversations beyond basic pleasantries about weather or weekend plans. "Can't say I've noticed anything," Pete replied, glancing toward the courtyard where Luna continued her repetitive circling. "She looks fine to me. Why do you ask?" Marcus hesitated, acutely aware that he was about to cross a line from which there might be no return. "I used to work with animals," he said carefully. "Some of her behaviors remind me of neurological problems I've seen before." Pete's expression shifted from casual interest to something approaching concern. "Neurological problems? Like what kind of problems?" "Brain disorders," Marcus said simply. "The kind that get worse quickly without treatment." Before Pete could respond, Luna's circling intensified, her movements becoming increasingly frantic. She stumbled once, caught herself, then stumbled again. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, her tongue lolling from her mouth in a way that suggested distress rather than simple exertion. "Maybe I should call Miss Sterling," Pete said uncertainly, reaching for the phone that connected directly to Victoria's office. "Wait," Marcus said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised them both. "Let me observe her for just a few more minutes. If I'm right about what's happening, timing might be critical." Pete nodded, perhaps recognizing something in Marcus's tone that suggested this wasn't mere curiosity from a concerned groundskeeper. They both watched as Luna's condition continued to deteriorate, her circling becoming more erratic, her coordination failing with each passing moment. Marcus felt the familiar weight of medical responsibility settling across his shoulders. The same sensation he'd experienced during emergency rotations, when split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. He'd walked away from this feeling once, choosing the safety of his daughter over the uncertainty of completing his degree. But watching Luna's distress reawakened something in him that no amount of landscaping could bury. "Pete," Marcus said quietly, his eyes never leaving Luna's increasingly desperate movements. "When this gets worse, and it's going to get worse very soon, Miss Sterling is going to need help from someone who understands what's happening." "What do you mean?" Pete asked, but his question was interrupted by a sound that made both men's blood run cold. Luna had begun to whimper, a high-pitched keening that spoke of confusion and fear. Her circling had become so rapid that she could barely maintain her balance, her golden coat now damp with the sweat of exertion and distress. Marcus checked his watch. 11:47. Victoria's morning meetings typically ran until noon, which meant Luna could be suffering for another 13 minutes before anyone with authority noticed her condition. 13 minutes that might prove critical depending on the underlying cause of her symptoms. "I need to get closer," Marcus told Pete, already moving toward the courtyard, despite the obvious breach of protocol this represented. "If she collapses, someone needs to be there who knows what to look for." Pete opened his mouth to object, then seemed to think better of it. Perhaps he recognized the futility of arguing with someone whose determination had shifted from polite concern to professional focus. Instead, he simply nodded and reached for his radio, alerting the other security personnel that something unusual was developing in the courtyard. Marcus approached Luna slowly, keeping his movements calm and predictable despite the urgency he felt. The dog's condition had deteriorated dramatically in just the past few minutes. Her circling had become violent, almost frenzied, and foam had begun to accumulate around her muzzle. "Easy girl," Marcus murmured, using the same soothing tone he'd once employed with frightened animals in examination rooms. "I see you. I know something's wrong." Luna seemed to respond to his voice, slowing her circling just enough to make eye contact. In her gaze, Marcus saw the same confusion and terror he'd witnessed in countless animals experiencing neurological crises. The desperate plea for help that transcended species barriers, the universal language of suffering that he'd trained himself to interpret and address. It was at that moment, as Marcus knelt beside the increasingly distressed animal, that Victoria Sterling emerged from the building for her lunch break. She walked briskly across the courtyard, her attention focused on the messages accumulating on her phone, completely unaware that her beloved companion was in the midst of a medical emergency. Marcus found himself at the intersection of two worlds, the one where he tended gardens and remained invisible, and the one where he possessed knowledge that could save lives. The choice he made in the next few seconds would determine not only Luna's fate, but the trajectory of his own carefully reconstructed existence. Luna's whimpering intensified, her coordination failing completely as her legs began to buckle. Marcus reached toward her instinctively, his hands remembering the gentle confidence that came from years of medical training. In that moment, he wasn't a groundskeeper anymore. He was Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, even if the title existed only in his own memory. And then Luna collapsed, her body convulsing as the fountain erupted in chaos around them, bringing Marcus face to face with the moment that would change everything. The emergency veterinary clinic on Maple Street buzzed with controlled chaos as Marcus carried Luna through the automatic doors. Victoria followed close behind, her usual corporate composure shattered into fragments of barely contained panic. The golden retriever lay limp in Marcus's arms, her breathing shallow and irregular, her once bright eyes now glassy and unfocused. Dr. Sarah Chen, the clinic's senior veterinarian, emerged from examination room 3 with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to animal emergencies. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her scrubs bore the telltale stains of a busy morning treating everything from routine vaccinations to surgical emergencies. "What's the presenting complaint, Doctor?" Chen asked, already leading them toward the treatment area, while her trained eye assessed Luna's condition. "She collapsed during seizure-like activity," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the clinical precision that Victoria found both reassuring and puzzling. "Progressive neurological symptoms over approximately 3 weeks, including circling behavior, ataxia, and altered mental status." Dr. Chen paused mid-stride, her eyebrows rising slightly. The terminology Marcus had used wasn't typical of concerned pet owners. Ataxia and altered mental status were veterinary terms, spoken with the confidence of someone familiar with medical protocols. "Are you in the veterinary field?" Dr. Chen asked directly, her hands already beginning their preliminary examination of Luna's vital signs. Marcus hesitated, acutely aware of Victoria's presence beside him. "I have some background in animal medicine," he said carefully,
the half-truth feeling heavy on his tongue. Victoria's sharp business instincts, momentarily suspended by concern for Luna, began to reassert themselves. "Marcus works for my company," she said, her voice carrying a note of confusion. "He's our groundskeeper." The words hung in the air like an accusation, creating an awkward tension that Dr. Chen chose to navigate with professional diplomacy. "Well, regardless of background, your observations are quite helpful," she said to Marcus before turning to Victoria. "I'll need to run some diagnostic tests to determine what we're dealing with." As Dr. Chen and her technician whisked Luna into the treatment area, Victoria and Marcus found themselves alone in the waiting room's sterile silence. The space felt designed for anxiety, with its bland beige walls and rows of plastic chairs that had witnessed countless vigils for beloved pets. "How did you know those medical terms?" Victoria asked finally, her voice carefully modulated, but carrying an undertone of suspicion that made Marcus's chest tighten. "I read a lot," Marcus replied, the evasion sounding weak even to his own ears. "When you work around animals every day, you pick things up." Victoria's gaze remained fixed on him with the same intensity she brought to corporate negotiations. "Picking things up doesn't explain the confidence with which you handled Luna during her seizure. You acted like someone with medical training." Marcus felt trapped between honesty and self-preservation. Revealing his veterinary background might help Luna receive better care, but it would also raise questions about why he was working as a groundskeeper instead of pursuing his intended career. Questions that led inevitably to explanations about Emma's death, his departure from veterinary school, and the careful rebuilding of his life around Sophia's needs. "I care about animals," Marcus said simply, hoping the truth of that statement would satisfy Victoria's curiosity without requiring deeper explanations. Before Victoria could press further, Dr. Chen reappeared with a clipboard full of forms and a grim expression that immediately commanded their attention. "I've completed the initial examination," she began, settling into the chair across from them. "Luna's presenting with classic signs of increased intracranial pressure. Her pupils are dilated and unresponsive, she has significant ataxia, and her mental status is severely altered." Victoria leaned forward, her face pale but focused. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means something is causing pressure to build inside Luna's skull," Dr. Chen explained. "This could be due to several factors: a brain tumor, an infection, trauma, or exposure to certain toxins. I'll need to run blood work, possibly imaging studies, to narrow down the cause." Marcus felt his veterinary training reasserting itself, despite his efforts to remain a passive observer. "What about her history?" he asked. "Any recent changes in diet, environment, or routine?" Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "Those are exactly the right questions. Miss Sterling, has Luna been exposed to anything unusual recently? New foods, cleaning products, plants, or medications?" Victoria shook her head slowly. "Nothing I can think of. She follows the same routine every day. Same food, same walks, same environment at the office." "What about supplements or treats?" Marcus pressed, his concern for Luna overriding his desire to remain inconspicuous. "Sometimes owners introduce new products without thinking of them as significant changes." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, but she answered the question. "Her trainer recommended some new treats last month, something imported from Europe, supposed to be better for coat health."
Dr. Chen made a note on her clipboard. "Do you have the packaging for those treats? I'd like to review the ingredients." "They're at home," Victoria replied. "Is that important?" "Potentially," Dr. Chen said. "Some imported products contain ingredients that aren't well regulated in the United States. If Luna's been consuming something toxic on a regular basis, it could explain the gradual onset of her symptoms." Marcus felt a familiar surge of investigative excitement, the same rush he'd experienced during his clinical rotations when pieces of a diagnostic puzzle began falling into place. "Dr. Chen, if you suspect toxicity, shouldn't we consider chelation therapy while we're waiting for test results?" Both women stared at him. Victoria's expression had shifted from confusion to something approaching suspicion, while Dr. Chen looked intrigued by the sophistication of his suggestion. Chelation therapy would only be appropriate if we knew the specific toxin involved, Dr. Chen replied carefully. But you're right, that early intervention can be critical in poisoning cases. Victoria stood abruptly, her movements sharp with barely contained agitation. I need some air, she announced, leaving Marcus and Dr. Chen alone in the waiting room. Chen waited until Victoria was out of earshot before leaning closer to Marcus. You're not just a groundskeeper, are you? Marcus met her gaze directly, recognizing in her eyes the same dedication to animal welfare that had once driven his own career aspirations. I was in veterinary school, he admitted quietly. 4 years completed, 6 months short of graduation. What happened? The question was simple, but it opened doors Marcus had worked hard to keep closed. Life, he said finally. Family responsibilities that couldn't wait for a degree. Dr. Chen nodded with the understanding of someone who'd seen talented people make difficult sacrifices. Well, your instincts are sound. Luna's symptoms are consistent with chronic heavy metal poisoning, possibly lead or mercury. If those treats contain contaminated ingredients, we might be looking at a case of gradual toxicity. Outside, Victoria paced the parking lot while making phone calls. Marcus could see her through the clinic's large windows, her gestures animated as she spoke to someone with obvious urgency. Probably her assistant, possibly her lawyer. People like Victoria Sterling didn't face crises without assembling teams of experts to manage every angle. 20 minutes later, Victoria returned with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested she'd reached some internal decision. She handed 1 cup to Marcus, then settled back into her chair with the deliberate calm of someone preparing for interrogation. I called my assistant and had her retrieve the treat packaging, Victoria said without preamble. The ingredients include something called European Mineral Complex and artisanal sea salt blend. Rather vague descriptions for products being fed to animals. Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, using the warmth of the cup to steady his hands. Vague labeling is often a red flag in pet products. Legitimate manufacturers are usually very specific about ingredients. How would you know that? Victoria asked, her tone direct but not hostile. Marcus realized he'd reached a crossroads where evasion would only deepen Victoria's suspicions while potentially compromising Luna's care. Because I spent 4 years studying veterinary medicine before circumstances forced me to leave school, he said. The admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. Victoria's expression shifted through several emotions, surprise, calculation, and something that might have been understanding. 4 years of veterinary school, and you're working as a groundskeeper. I needed a job with good health insurance and predictable hours, Marcus explained. I have a 12-year-old daughter with asthma. Stability became more important than completing my degree. Before Victoria could respond, Dr. Chen emerged with Luna on a leash, the dog moving slowly but upright. Good news, she announced. Luna's responding well to the initial treatment. I've started her on chelation therapy based on our discussion about potential heavy metal exposure. Victoria's relief was immediate and visible. She looks better already. The improvement will be gradual, Dr. Chen cautioned. But if we've caught this early enough, the prognosis is good. I'll need to see those treat packages as soon as possible, and we should discuss having them analyzed by a laboratory. As they prepared to leave the clinic, Victoria turned to Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. I owe you an apology, she said quietly, and probably Luna's life. You don't owe me anything, Marcus replied. I just happened to notice something that needed attention. No, Victoria said firmly. You did much more than notice. You diagnosed a condition that I missed, my regular veterinarian missed, and probably would have killed Luna if left untreated. The drive back to Sterling Dynamics passed in thoughtful silence. Luna rested peacefully in the back seat, her breathing steadier than it had been in weeks. Marcus stared out the passenger window, wondering how this day's events would affect the careful balance he'd maintained between his 2 lives. Victoria broke the silence as they pulled into the corporate parking lot. "I'd like to discuss something with you," she said. "But not here. Would you be willing to meet for dinner tomorrow night? I'll arrange childcare for your daughter if needed." Marcus felt a familiar wariness. In his experience, dinner invitations from employers rarely led to comfortable conversations. "What kind of discussion?" "The kind that might benefit both of us," Victoria replied cryptically. "And possibly Luna." That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table helping Sophia with her science homework while Luna's medical crisis replayed in his mind. Sophia had always been perceptive about her father's moods, and tonight was no exception. "You helped someone today," she observed without looking up from her textbook. "I can tell by your face." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "You get this look when you fix something important," Sophia explained, finally meeting his eyes. "Like when Mrs. Patterson's cat got stuck in the storm drain last year, or when you figured out why all the fish in Mr. Chen's pond were dying." Marcus smiled despite himself. Sophia had inherited her mother's gift for reading people, combined with a scientist's eye for detail that sometimes unnerved him. "It was Luna, Miss Sterling's dog from work. She was sick and I was able to help figure out what was wrong. The pretty golden retriever you've told me about. That's the one." Sophia closed her textbook with the decisive snap of someone reaching an important conclusion. "So when are you going back to school?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "What do you mean?" "Dad," Sophia said with the patient tone of someone explaining the obvious to a particularly slow adult, "you've been talking about that dog's weird behavior for weeks. You diagnosed her problem when actual doctors couldn't. And now you're sitting here looking like you remember who you used to be before Mom died." Marcus felt his throat tighten. Sophia rarely spoke directly about Emma's death or its aftermath, preferring to navigate around the subject with the emotional intelligence of someone who'd learned early that some topics required careful handling. "It's not that simple, sweetheart," Marcus said gently. "Going back to school would mean giving up the job that provides our health insurance. It would mean financial uncertainty while I completed my degree. It would also mean doing what you're supposed to be doing." Sophia replied with the blunt honesty that made her both wonderful and occasionally devastating. "Mom always said you were meant to heal animals, not just grow pretty flowers for people who don't even notice you exist." The observation stung because it contained uncomfortable truths Marcus had been avoiding. Emma had indeed believed passionately in his veterinary aspirations, had encouraged him to pursue his degree, even when money was tight and the future uncertain. She died believing he would become the veterinarian he'd always dreamed of being. Maybe, Marcus conceded, but dreams don't always survive reality. Maybe reality doesn't always know what it's talking about, Sophia countered, then softened her tone. "I'm not saying you should quit your job tomorrow, Dad. I'm just saying maybe it's time to consider that there might be other possibilities." The next evening, Marcus found himself in an upscale restaurant downtown, feeling underdressed despite Sophia's insistence that he wear his best shirt. Victoria had chosen a quiet corner table away from the main dining area, creating a sense of privacy that made their conversation feel significant before it even began. "Thank you for coming," Victoria said as Marcus settled into his chair. "I know this might seem unusual." "It definitely seems unusual," Marcus agreed, accepting the menu from an attentive waiter. "But I'm curious about what you wanted to discuss." Victoria waited until they'd ordered before launching into what sounded like a prepared presentation. "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday," she began. "About how your background in veterinary medicine proved critical in diagnosing Luna's condition. Dr. Chen deserves most of the credit," Marcus deflected. "I just provided some observations. Observations that saved Luna's life," Victoria corrected. "And observations that came from knowledge and training that you're not currently using." Marcus felt the conversation heading in a direction that made him uncomfortable. "My current job serves my family's needs very well. What if there was a way to serve your family's needs while also using your medical training?" Victoria asked. "What if Sterling Dynamics could benefit from having someone with your expertise on staff?" "I'm not sure I follow." Victoria leaned forward, her expression animated with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling a business plan. We have contracts with several pharmaceutical companies that conduct animal testing. We also have a large campus with extensive grounds that could support wildlife rehabilitation programs. What if we created a position that combined your groundskeeping experience with your veterinary knowledge? Marcus blinked, trying to process the unexpected offer. You're talking about creating a job that doesn't currently exist. I'm talking about creating a job that should exist, Victoria corrected. Environmental compliance officer with veterinary consultation responsibilities, someone who ensures our corporate practices align with animal welfare standards while maintaining our grounds. The proposal was intriguing, but felt almost too good to be true. What would that mean in practical terms? Better salary, full benefits including educational assistance if you wanted to complete your degree, and responsibilities that actually utilize your training and expertise. Marcus felt Sophia's words from the previous evening echoing in his mind. Maybe reality doesn't always know what it's talking about. Here was Victoria Sterling, offering to reshape reality to accommodate possibilities he'd stopped believing were available to him. Why? Marcus asked simply. Why would you do this? Victoria's expression softened, revealing something more personal beneath her professional demeanor. Because watching you with Luna yesterday reminded me of something I'd forgotten about leadership. Sometimes the most valuable insights come from unexpected sources, and sometimes the people we overlook are exactly the ones we should be listening to most carefully. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. I've built my career on recognizing talent and creating opportunities that benefit everyone involved. You have knowledge and skills that my company could use, and I have resources that could help you complete your education and build the career you originally planned. Marcus felt the weight of possibilities settling over him, like a mantle he wasn't sure he was ready to wear. I'd need to think about it. Discuss it with my daughter. Of course, Victoria agreed. But while you're thinking, I want you to know that Luna's blood work came back today. The treats contained elevated levels of lead and mercury, just as you suspected. Dr. Chen said without early intervention, Luna might not have survived another week. The information hit Marcus with unexpected force. His diagnostic instincts hadn't just been correct, they'd been life-saving. The knowledge he'd carried for years, dormant but not forgotten, had proven its value when it mattered most. I'm glad she's going to be okay, Marcus said quietly. She's going to be okay because you saw what others missed, Victoria replied. Because you had the courage to speak up despite the social dynamics that normally keep groundskeepers from offering medical advice to CEOs. As they finished dinner, Victoria handed Marcus a business card with her direct phone number written on the back. Think about my offer, she said. But also think about this. How many other animals might benefit from having someone with your expertise in a position where their voice actually carries weight? Marcus drove home through quiet suburban streets, his mind churning with possibilities and concerns in equal measure. Victoria's offer represented everything he'd thought he'd given up when he left veterinary school: professional respect, intellectual challenge, and the opportunity to use his training to help animals. But it also represented risk. Change meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant potential disruption to the stable life he'd built for Sophia. The health insurance he currently received was excellent, covering Sophia's asthma medications without question. His current job, while unfulfilling intellectually, provided predictable hours that allowed him to be present for Sophia's school events and medical appointments. Yet Sophia's words continued to resonate. Mom always said you were meant to heal animals, not just grow pretty flowers for people who don't even notice you exist. Marcus pulled into his driveway to find Sophia waiting up for him, homework spread across the kitchen table, but her attention clearly focused on the door. She looked up expectantly as he entered, her expression a mixture of curiosity and hope that made his chest tight with affection. How did it go? She asked without preamble. Marcus settled into the chair across from her, noting that her science textbook was open to a chapter on veterinary medicine. She offered me a different job, one that would use my veterinary training. Sophia's face lit up with excitement. Really? What kind of job? Environmental compliance officer with veterinary consultation responsibilities, Marcus recited, the title still feeling surreal. It would mean better pay, educational assistance to finish my degree, and work that actually uses my medical knowledge. That sounds perfect, Sophia said immediately. What's the catch? Marcus smiled despite himself. Sophia's pragmatism was both a blessing and occasionally a burden. Change is always risky. My current job provides excellent insurance and predictable hours. This new position would be uncharted territory. Dad, Sophia said with the patient tone she reserved for moments when she felt he was being unnecessarily obtuse. Uncharted territory is where discoveries happen. Safe territory is where dreams go to die. The observation was so purely Emma that Marcus felt his breath catch. His wife had possessed the same fearless optimism, the same belief that opportunities should be embraced rather than feared. She'd encouraged him to apply to veterinary school despite their limited finances, had supported his decision to pursue his dreams even when practical considerations suggested more conservative choices. Your mother used to say things like that, Marcus said softly. I know, Sophia replied. I listen when you tell stories about her, and I think she'd want you to take this job, even if it means less stability. Sophia closed her textbook and gave him the direct look that always reminded him how much older than 12 she sometimes seemed. Dad, stability without purpose isn't really stability. It's just fear wearing a fancy name. That night Marcus lay awake considering the convergence of circumstances that had brought him to this moment. Luna's illness, his instinctive response, Victoria's unexpected offer, and Sophia's unwavering support had aligned like celestial bodies, creating a unique gravitational pull toward change. He thought about the animals he might help in a position that combined environmental oversight with veterinary consultation, about the satisfaction of using his knowledge to prevent suffering rather than simply maintaining decorative landscapes, about the possibility of completing his degree and finally becoming the veterinarian Emma had always believed he would be. But he also thought about the security his current job provided, the health insurance that protected Sophia, and the careful stability he'd built from the wreckage of his original plans. Change meant risk, and risk meant the possibility of loss. He'd already lost Emma. He couldn't bear the thought of making decisions that might somehow jeopardize Sophia's well-being. The internal debate continued for 3 days. Marcus went about his regular groundskeeping duties, while wrestling with competing desires for security and fulfillment. He watched Luna during her recovery, noting her improved coordination and alertness as the chelation therapy cleared the toxins from her system. Dr. Chen had confirmed that early intervention had prevented permanent neurological damage, a fact that underscored the value of his diagnostic contribution. On Thursday morning, Marcus found an envelope on his workstation in the groundskeeping shed. Inside was a formal job offer from Sterling Dynamics, detailing salary, benefits, and educational assistance that exceeded his current compensation by nearly 50%. The position would begin with a 6-month probationary period, during which he could complete his final veterinary school requirements through a distance learning program that Victoria had researched and pre-approved. Attached to the offer was a handwritten note from Victoria. Luna's full recovery is expected within 2 weeks. Dr. Chen attributes this entirely to early diagnosis and intervention. Your expertise saved her life. Now let's see what else we can accomplish together. Marcus stared at the documents, feeling the weight of opportunity and responsibility in equal measure. The offer was generous almost beyond belief, addressing every practical concern he'd raised while opening doors he'd thought permanently closed. Yet accepting meant abandoning the careful equilibrium he'd maintained for years, stepping into uncertainty despite the potential rewards. That afternoon Marcus found himself in Dr. Chen's clinic, ostensibly checking on Luna's progress but actually seeking perspective from someone who understood the veterinary profession from the inside. She's doing remarkably well, Dr. Chen reported as they watched Luna play with a rope toy in the clinic's exercise area. Full neurological function restored, no apparent lasting effects from the toxicity.
I'm glad, Marcus said, meaning it deeply. Dr. Chen studied him with the same perceptive gaze she brought to animal patients. You're wrestling with something, she observed. Want to talk about it? Marcus found himself explaining Victoria's job offer, his concerns about change, and his uncertainty about whether he was making the right decision for his family. Dr. Chen listened with the patience of someone accustomed to helping people navigate difficult choices. Can I ask you something? Dr. Chen said when Marcus finished. If money and insurance weren't factors, if you knew your daughter would be taken care of regardless, what would you want to do?
The answer came without hesitation. Complete my degree and practice veterinary medicine. Then it sounds like you have your answer, Dr. Chen said simply. The practical concerns are important, but they're not insurmountable. And from what you've described, this opportunity addresses most of them while moving you toward your actual goal. What if I fail? Marcus asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at him. What if I've been away from veterinary studies too long, or I can't handle the transition back to academic work? Dr. Chen smiled with the confidence of someone who'd observed his diagnostic skills firsthand. Marcus, you diagnosed chronic heavy metal poisoning in a case where the symptoms had been developing gradually over weeks. You recognized neurological patterns that I might have missed if you hadn't pointed them out. You haven't lost your veterinary instincts, you've just been applying them to plants instead of animals. As Marcus drove home that evening, Luna's recovery playing in his mind like a success story he'd authored but not claimed, he realized that Dr. Chen was right. His veterinary knowledge hadn't atrophied during his years as a groundskeeper. It had simply been dormant, waiting for an opportunity to prove its continued relevance. The decision crystallized as he watched Sophia practice violin in their living room, her concentration absolute as she worked through a challenging passage. She'd inherited Emma's musical talent along with her determination, approaching obstacles with the methodical persistence of someone who believed problems existed to be solved rather than avoided. When Sophia finished her practice session, Marcus called her to the kitchen table, where Victoria's job offer lay spread like blueprints for a different future. I've decided to accept the position, he announced, watching Sophia's face light up with excitement and relief. Really? You're going to be a veterinarian again? I'm going to try, Marcus corrected. It'll mean changes for both of us. Evening classes, study time that cuts into our weekend activities, and probably some stress while I readjust to academic work. Sophia nodded seriously. But it also means you'll be doing what you're supposed to be doing. What Mom always wanted you to do. What I've always wanted to do, Marcus admitted, the acknowledgement feeling like permission he'd been afraid to grant himself. Friday morning, Marcus walked into Victoria's office, carrying his signed acceptance letter and a nervous energy that reminded him of his first day of veterinary school years earlier. Victoria's smile upon seeing the documents suggested she'd never doubted his decision, though Marcus suspected she'd been more anxious about his response than she'd let on. "Welcome to your new position," Victoria said, extending her hand with formal congratulations before her expression softened into something more personal. "I think Luna would approve." As if summoned by her name, Luna emerged from behind Victoria's desk, her tail wagging with the enthusiasm of complete health. She approached Marcus with obvious recognition and affection, nuzzling his hand in greeting. "She remembers you," Victoria observed with obvious pleasure. Marcus knelt to scratch behind Luna's ears, noting the clarity in her eyes and the steadiness of her movements. "She looks like a completely different dog. Thanks to you," Victoria said. "And hopefully this is just the beginning of what we can accomplish together." As Marcus left Victoria's office with orientation materials for his new position, he felt the peculiar sensation of stepping into a future he'd thought lost forever. The path ahead contained uncertainties and challenges, but it also contained possibility in quantities he'd forgotten he was allowed to hope for. That evening, he called Dr. Chen to share the news and discuss the logistics of completing his veterinary degree while working full-time. She listened with genuine enthusiasm, offering to serve as a reference for his readmission to the program and providing contacts at veterinary schools with strong distance learning components. "You're doing the right thing," Dr. Chen assured him. "The veterinary field needs people like you, people who see what others miss and have the courage to act on their observations." As Marcus tucked Sophia into bed that night, she asked the question that had been lingering unspoken between them. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" Marcus considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Emma had died believing in his potential, encouraging his dreams even when circumstances made them seem impossible. She'd wanted him to become a veterinarian, not just for professional fulfillment, but because she'd recognized something essential about who he was and what he was meant to contribute to the world. "I think she'd be proud that we finally found the courage to try again," Marcus said softly. "And I think she'd be especially proud of you for encouraging me to take the chance." Sophia smiled with satisfaction, settling deeper into her pillow. "Luna's lucky you were there." "We're all lucky when people notice what needs attention," Marcus replied, thinking not just of Luna, but of Victoria's willingness to see potential in an overlooked groundskeeper, of Dr. Chen's encouragement, and of Sophia's unwavering belief in possibilities. As he turned off Sophia's bedroom light, Marcus felt something shift inside him, a realignment of identity that had been years in the making. Tomorrow he would begin the transition from groundskeeper to environmental compliance officer, to veterinary student to the professional he'd always been meant to become. The journey would be challenging, requiring him to balance work responsibilities with academic demands while maintaining his commitment to Sophia's needs. But for the first time since Emma's death, Marcus felt certain he was moving in the right direction, guided by instincts that had never really abandoned him, and supported by people who'd recognized his worth when he'd stopped believing in it himself. Luna's recovery had been just the beginning. Now came the harder work of rebuilding a career, completing an education, and proving that second chances sometimes led to better outcomes than first attempts ever could have achieved. The lecture hall at Pacific Northwest Veterinary College buzzed with pre-class conversations as Marcus settled into a seat in the third row, his notebook open and pen ready. 6 months had passed since he'd accepted Victoria's offer, and tonight marked his return to formal veterinary education after a 7-year absence. The familiar scent of disinfectant and the sight of anatomical charts covering the walls triggered memories both painful and hopeful. Dr. Rebecca Walsh entered the classroom with the purposeful stride of someone who commanded immediate attention. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her lab coat bore the subtle stains that marked her as someone who practiced what she taught. She surveyed the evening class with shrewd eyes that seemed to catalogue each student's level of preparation and commitment. "Welcome to Advanced Diagnostic Pathology," Dr. Walsh began, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in veterinary medicine. "This course will challenge everything you think you know about identifying disease patterns in companion animals." Marcus felt a familiar thrill of intellectual anticipation, the same sensation he'd experienced as a younger student eager to absorb knowledge that could save lives. But now that enthusiasm was tempered by practical experience, by the understanding that theoretical knowledge meant nothing without the courage to apply it when circumstances demanded action. "Tonight we'll begin with a case study," Dr. Walsh continued, clicking to her first slide. A 6-year-old golden retriever presenting with progressive neurological symptoms over a 3-week period. The initial veterinary examination suggested possible brain tumor or stroke, but subsequent testing revealed an entirely different diagnosis. Marcus's attention sharpened as familiar images appeared on the screen. Luna's case, he realized with surprise, though Dr. Walsh was presenting it without identifying details. The photographs showed the same progression Marcus had witnessed: the initial confusion, the circling behavior, the eventual collapse. The key breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Dr. Walsh explained, advancing to slides showing blood work and toxicology reports. Someone without formal veterinary credentials noticed behavioral patterns that trained professionals had overlooked, leading to early intervention that prevented permanent neurological damage.
A student in the front row raised her hand. What made this person's observations different from the veterinary professionals who examined the animal? Dr. Walsh smiled with evident approval at the question. Distance from assumptions, the medical professionals focused on common causes of neurological symptoms in older dogs. The observer, working from basic behavioral analysis, considered environmental factors that had been dismissed as routine. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, recognizing the subtle irony of having his own diagnostic contribution analyzed in an academic setting. Several classmates around him were taking detailed notes, treating Luna's case as theoretical, rather than the very real crisis that had reshaped his life. The toxicology revealed chronic heavy metal poisoning from contaminated treats. Dr. Walsh continued, a diagnosis that required connecting seemingly unrelated environmental exposures with progressive neurological decline. The lesson here is that expertise sometimes blinds us to simple explanations. After class, Marcus approached Dr. Walsh with questions about laboratory analysis techniques for environmental toxins. She answered with the enthusiasm of someone who appreciated genuine intellectual curiosity, but her expression shifted when Marcus mentioned his practical experience with similar cases. You speak with unusual confidence about diagnostic protocols, Dr. Walsh observed. May I ask about your background? Marcus hesitated, then decided that honesty had served him well during his transition back to veterinary studies. I work as an environmental compliance officer for Sterling Dynamics, with veterinary consultation responsibilities. The case you presented tonight was actually one I was involved with professionally. Dr. Walsh's eyebrows rose with interest rather than surprise. You were the observer who identified the environmental connection. I noticed patterns that suggested neurological toxicity. Marcus replied carefully. The actual diagnosis and treatment were handled by Dr. Sarah Chen at Maple Street Veterinary Clinic. Nevertheless, Dr. Walsh said, your contribution demonstrates exactly what I was trying to illustrate tonight. Sometimes the most valuable insights come from approaching problems without preconceived limitations. As Marcus drove home through the quiet suburban streets, he reflected on the strange circularity of his situation. 6 months ago he'd been a groundskeeper whose veterinary knowledge existed in exile. Now he was studying that same knowledge in formal academic settings while applying it professionally in ways he'd never anticipated. His new position at Sterling Dynamics had evolved far beyond the environmental compliance role Victoria had originally envisioned. Marcus found himself consulting on animal welfare protocols for the company's pharmaceutical research partnerships, developing wildlife-friendly landscaping that supported local ecosystems, and serving as a liaison with veterinary colleges for internship programs. The work challenged him intellectually while allowing him to apply both his horticultural experience and his veterinary training. But more importantly, it had restored his sense of professional identity, reminding him that knowledge without application was merely academic exercise. Sophia greeted him at the door with violin case in hand and an expression of barely contained excitement. Dad, you'll never guess what happened at school today. Tell me, Marcus said, hanging his jacket on the hall closet hook while noting that Sophia had already completed her homework and prepared tomorrow's lunch. Her increasing independence both impressed and occasionally worried him. Mrs. Patterson asked me to give a presentation about careers in veterinary medicine, Sophia announced. She said since my dad was studying to be a veterinarian I could share what I'd learned about the profession. Marcus felt a flush of pride mixed with surprise. Sophia rarely discussed his career transition with her classmates, preferring to maintain privacy about their family circumstances. What did you tell them?
I explained how veterinarians help animals when they're sick, but also how they prevent animals from getting sick in the first place, Sophia said, settling onto the couch with obvious satisfaction. And I told them about Luna and how you figured out what was wrong when the other doctors couldn't. How did they respond? Sophia grinned with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully commanded an audience. Tommy Williams said his dad thinks all animals should just stay wild and not need doctors. But Jessica Chen, she's Dr. Chen's daughter, said her mom told her that the best veterinarians are the ones who really pay attention to what animals are trying to tell them. Marcus smiled at the unexpected wisdom of 12-year-olds processing complex professional concepts. What do you think makes a good veterinarian? Sophia considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. I think it's someone who cares more about helping animals than about looking smart. Someone like you. The compliment settled into Marcus's chest with warmth that surprised him. For years he'd struggled with feelings of professional inadequacy, convinced that leaving veterinary school had marked him as someone who lacked the dedication necessary for medical practice. But Sophia's perspective reminded him that dedication took many forms, not all of them conventional. Tuesday evening brought a call that would test every diagnostic skill Marcus had developed during his months of professional transition. Victoria's voice carried an urgency that immediately commanded his attention. "Marcus, I need your help," she said without preamble. "There's been an incident at one of our research partner facilities. Multiple animals showing neurological symptoms, and the attending veterinarian is baffled." Marcus felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. What kind of research facility? Biomedical testing laboratory. They maintain colonies of laboratory mice and rats for pharmaceutical trials. This morning, technicians found dozens of animals exhibiting circling behavior, seizures, and motor dysfunction. The symptoms triggered immediate recognition based on Marcus's recent academic studies. How many animals are affected? Approximately 40% of their research population, Victoria replied. The facility's veterinarian suspects infectious disease, but initial testing has been inconclusive. They've requested consultation from someone with environmental toxicology experience. Marcus realized he was being asked to apply his developing expertise in a high-stakes professional setting. When do they need the consultation? Tonight, if possible. I know it's short notice, but the research protocols require immediate intervention if we're going to prevent total population loss. An hour later, Marcus found himself in the fluorescent-lit corridors of Cascade Research Institute, following Dr. Amanda Foster through security checkpoints that suggested the serious nature of the work conducted within these walls. Dr. Foster, a veterinary pathologist with 15 years of laboratory medicine experience, briefed Marcus on the situation as they walked. Symptoms began appearing around 6 o'clock this morning, Dr. Foster explained. Initially just a few animals in the colony room 3, but it spread to adjoining areas. The pattern suggests either infectious agent or environmental exposure. What protocols have you implemented? Marcus asked, noting the biosecurity measures they were following. Complete isolation of affected areas, enhanced ventilation, and preliminary blood work on symptomatic animals. But I'll be honest, I'm seeing patterns I don't recognize. They entered an observation area overlooking the main colony room where Marcus could see laboratory technicians in protective gear monitoring dozens of small enclosures. Through the glass, several animals were visible exhibiting the neurological symptoms Dr. Foster had described. Marcus studied the affected animals with growing concern. The circling behavior was pronounced and repetitive, suggesting significant neurological dysfunction. Several animals showed tremors and coordination problems that reminded him uncomfortably of Luna's initial presentation. Dr. Foster, have there been any recent changes to the facility's environmental systems? Marcus asked. New cleaning protocols, construction or equipment installations? Nothing significant, Dr. Foster replied. Routine maintenance on the ventilation system last week, but that's standard procedure. What about the ventilation maintenance specifically? Were any filters changed, ductwork cleaned, or chemical treatments applied? Dr. Foster paused, her expression shifting from dismissive to concerned. The maintenance company did mention using a new antimicrobial treatment in the air handling system, something they claimed was more effective than the previous protocol. Marcus felt the familiar surge of diagnostic certainty that had characterized his work on Luna's case. Do you have the specifications for that antimicrobial treatment? I can get them, Dr. Foster said, already reaching for her phone. 20 minutes later, Marcus was reviewing technical documentation that confirmed his growing suspicions.
The new antimicrobial treatment contained organophosphate compounds that, while effective against bacteria and viruses, could produce neurological toxicity in mammals if concentrations exceeded safe thresholds. The symptoms match organophosphate poisoning, Marcus explained to Dr. Foster as they reviewed the chemical analysis. Circling behavior, tremors, seizures, all consistent with cholinesterase inhibition affecting the nervous system. Dr. Foster studied the documentation with increasing alarm. If you're right, we need to evacuate the facility immediately and begin chelation therapy for affected animals. How quickly can you implement those measures? Within the hour, if I can convince administration that we're dealing with environmental poisoning rather than infectious disease. Marcus understood the institutional challenge Dr. Foster faced. Acknowledging environmental poisoning meant accepting responsibility for facility management failures, while infectious disease could be attributed to uncontrollable biological factors. Would it help if I presented the diagnostic evidence directly to your administration? Marcus offered. Dr. Foster looked surprised by the suggestion. You'd be willing to do that, if it helps the animals receive appropriate treatment faster? Yes. The emergency meeting convened 30 minutes later in a sterile conference room filled with facility administrators, research directors, and insurance representatives. Marcus found himself once again in the position of defending diagnostic conclusions to skeptical authority figures, but this time he carried both academic credentials and professional confidence that had been absent during his earlier encounters with institutional resistance. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the facility's research director, opened the meeting with barely concealed skepticism. Dr. Foster has requested this consultation based on concerns about environmental toxicity. Can you walk us through your assessment? Marcus presented his findings methodically, connecting the timeline of symptom onset with the introduction of new antimicrobial treatments, correlating neurological presentations with known organophosphate toxicity patterns, and outlining treatment protocols that could prevent permanent damage if implemented quickly. Your diagnosis relies heavily on circumstantial evidence, observed Robert Chen, the facility's risk management director. Wouldn't infectious disease be a more likely explanation for such rapid symptom spread? Infectious disease typically follows predictable transmission patterns, Marcus replied. What we're seeing here is simultaneous onset across multiple areas that share only common ventilation systems. The symptom progression and neurological specificity point strongly toward chemical rather than biological causation. Dr. Martinez leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd identified a crucial weakness. Mr. Rodriguez, I understand you're currently completing your veterinary degree rather than practicing as a licensed veterinarian. What qualifies you to override the clinical judgment of our staff veterinarian? The question struck at Marcus's persistent insecurities about his professional status, but it also clarified something important about the nature of expertise. I'm not overriding anyone's judgment, Marcus replied calmly. I'm providing environmental analysis based on training and experience that complement Dr. Foster's medical expertise. Sometimes different perspectives reveal patterns that individual specializations might miss. What treatment are you recommending? Dr. Foster asked, choosing to focus on practical solutions rather than credential debates. Immediate facility evacuation and atmospheric clearing, followed by supportive care including atropine administration for animals showing severe cholinergic symptoms, environmental monitoring to confirm organophosphate clearance before reoccupation. The room fell silent as administrators calculated the costs associated with Marcus's recommendations. Facility evacuation meant research delays, financial losses, and potential regulatory scrutiny that could affect ongoing contracts. Dr. Martinez spoke first. The recommendations you're making would shut down our operations for at least a week. Do you understand the financial implications? I understand that without intervention you're looking at potential total population loss and regulatory investigation that could shut down operations permanently, Marcus replied. Early intervention minimizes both biological and financial damage, Dr. Foster stepped forward with obvious determination. I'm implementing Mr. Rodriguez's treatment recommendations immediately. The animals under my care take priority over administrative concerns. 2 hours later, Marcus stood in the facility's parking lot watching as animal transport vehicles carried research populations to temporary housing at partner institutions. The evacuation had proceeded smoothly once Dr. Foster assumed medical authority, but Marcus could see the stress of institutional conflict weighing on her shoulders. "Thank you," Dr. Foster said as they watched the last transport vehicle disappear into the night. "Those animals would have died without your environmental analysis."
"You made the difficult decisions," Marcus replied. "I just provided information. Information that saved lives," Dr. Foster corrected, "and information that came from someone willing to think beyond conventional diagnostic categories." As Marcus drove home through empty streets, he reflected on how dramatically his professional identity had evolved over the past 6 months. The groundskeeper who'd noticed Luna's symptoms had become someone whose environmental expertise could influence institutional policies and save animal lives on a much larger scale. But the evening's events had also highlighted persistent challenges in his transition back to veterinary practice. Despite his diagnostic successes, questions about credentials and authority continued to shadow his professional interactions. The path from incomplete veterinary education to full professional recognition remained complex and uncertain. Sophia was asleep when Marcus arrived home, but she'd left a note on the kitchen table written in her careful script. "Dad, Mrs. Patterson said college applications often ask about family members who've overcome challenges to pursue their dreams. I told her I already know what I'm going to write about." Marcus smiled despite his exhaustion, recognizing in Sophia's words the same supportive encouragement that had sustained him through months of career transition. She'd watched him struggle with self-doubt, witnessed his growing confidence, and somehow understood that his journey represented possibilities for both of them. The following morning brought a call from Dr. Walsh with news that would accelerate Marcus's timeline toward completing his veterinary degree. "Marcus, I've been following your consultation work with Sterling Dynamics and the research facility incident," she said. "I'd like to discuss an opportunity that might interest you." "What kind of opportunity?" "The college is developing a new practitioner pathway for students with extensive field experience, but incomplete formal credentials. It's designed for people exactly like you, individuals whose practical knowledge exceeds their academic documentation." Marcus felt his pulse quicken with unexpected hope. What would that involve? Accelerated completion of remaining coursework through portfolio assessment and practical demonstration rather than traditional semester requirements. You could potentially complete your degree within 8 months instead of the typical 2 years. The possibility seemed almost too good to be true. "What's the evaluation process?" "Comprehensive assessment of your diagnostic casework, written examinations covering core competencies, and practical demonstrations of clinical skills. It's rigorous, but it recognizes that knowledge comes from multiple sources. Would I be able to maintain my current position while completing the program?" "That's one of the program's advantages," Dr. Walsh explained. "It's designed around working professionals who've developed veterinary expertise through non-traditional pathways." That evening, Marcus shared the news with Victoria during their monthly consultation meeting about Sterling Dynamics' animal welfare programs. Her response exceeded his expectations. "The company would be happy to provide whatever support you need for accelerated degree completion," Victoria said immediately. "Educational leave, flexible scheduling, even funding for examination fees if necessary. Why would Sterling Dynamics invest that much in my education?" Victoria smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose business instincts had proven correct. "Because you've already demonstrated value far beyond your original job description. The research facility consultation alone saved our partner institution hundreds of thousands in potential losses. I was just applying diagnostic principles I'd learned academically. You were solving problems that others couldn't solve," Victoria corrected. "And you were doing it with confidence and competence that comes from understanding animals at a fundamental level." As Marcus prepared for the portfolio assessment that would determine his eligibility for the accelerated program, he found himself reviewing not just his recent consultation work but the entire journey that had brought him to this point. Luna's case had been the catalyst, but his growing confidence came from months of applying veterinary knowledge in diverse professional contexts. The assessment took place over 3 intensive days at Pacific Northwest Veterinary College. Marcus presented case studies from his environmental compliance work, demonstrated diagnostic techniques he'd developed through practical experience, and completed written examinations covering everything from pharmacology to surgical principles. Dr. Walsh presided over the evaluation panel with 2 other faculty members, each bringing different perspectives to assessing Marcus's readiness for accelerated degree completion. The process felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, combining academic rigor with recognition of practical expertise in ways that traditional veterinary education rarely accommodated. Mr. Rodriguez, Dr. Walsh said as the evaluation concluded, "Your diagnostic reasoning demonstrates mastery of core veterinary principles. Your case presentations show both theoretical knowledge and practical application skills. Most importantly, your approach to problem-solving reflects the kind of analytical thinking we want in practicing veterinarians." Marcus waited for the qualification that would explain why his application had been denied, but instead Dr. Walsh smiled with obvious satisfaction. "Welcome to the Accelerated Practitioner Program. We expect to see you graduate with full veterinary credentials within 8 months." The news felt surreal after years of believing his veterinary aspirations had been permanently derailed. Marcus called Sophia from the college parking lot, his voice shaking with excitement and disbelief as he shared the outcome. "I knew it," Sophia said with the confidence of someone whose faith had never wavered. "Dr. Rodriguez has a nice sound to it." "I still have 8 months of intensive study ahead," Marcus warned. 8 months until you become the veterinarian Mom always knew you'd be," Sophia corrected. "I'm proud of you, Dad." That evening, Marcus sat in his kitchen surrounded by the veterinary textbooks he'd purchased for the accelerated program, feeling the weight of possibility and responsibility in equal measure. The path ahead would require balancing intensive academic work with his expanding professional duties at Sterling Dynamics, all while maintaining his commitment to Sophia's needs. But for the first time since Emma's death, Marcus felt certain he was moving toward the future she'd envisioned for him. The groundskeeper who'd noticed Luna's symptoms had become someone whose veterinary expertise could influence policies, save lives, and inspire others to pursue their own deferred dreams. 8 months later, Marcus stood on the stage of Pacific Northwest Veterinary College's graduation ceremony, wearing the academic regalia that marked his completion of the Doctor of Veterinary Medicine degree. Sophia sat in the front row, her applause enthusiastic enough to draw smiles from surrounding families. Victoria Sterling had insisted on attending the ceremony, bringing Luna as her guest despite the unusual nature of having a dog present at an academic event. Luna wore a small graduation cap that Sophia had crafted, her tail wagging with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that celebration was appropriate, even if the details remained mysterious. Dr. Walsh delivered the keynote address, speaking about veterinary medicine's evolving recognition that expertise could develop through diverse pathways. She used Marcus's journey as an example of how practical experience and academic knowledge could combine to create practitioners uniquely qualified to address complex animal health challenges. The veterinary profession needs doctors who can see beyond traditional diagnostic categories, Dr. Walsh concluded. Doctors who bring environmental awareness, interdisciplinary thinking, and the humility to learn from unexpected sources. As Marcus accepted his diploma, he thought about the circular journey that had brought him to this moment. Luna's illness had forced him to choose between professional invisibility and diagnostic courage. That choice had led to opportunities he'd never imagined, relationships that had reshaped his career trajectory, and ultimately to the completion of dreams he'd thought permanently abandoned.
The reception following graduation brought congratulations from classmates, faculty, and professional colleagues who'd supported Marcus's unconventional path back to veterinary medicine. But the moment that meant most came when Sophia approached with a gift wrapped in paper decorated with cartoon animals. "Open it," she insisted, her eyes bright with anticipation. Inside the package was a framed photograph of Luna on the day of her collapse, paired with a recent image showing her healthy and alert. Between the photographs, Sophia had written in careful script, "Sometimes the best doctors are the ones who never stopped caring, even when nobody was watching." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion that threatened to overwhelm his composure. "Thank you, sweetheart. Thank you for showing me that dreams don't have expiration dates," Sophia replied, "and for proving that taking care of animals is worth whatever it costs." As the celebration continued around them, Marcus reflected on the transformation that had reshaped not just his career but his understanding of how professional identity could evolve through unexpected circumstances. The groundskeeper who'd worked in institutional shadows had become Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, environmental veterinarian, with expertise that bridged multiple disciplines. But more importantly, he'd become someone who understood that knowledge meant nothing without the courage to apply it when circumstances demanded action. Luna's crisis had taught him that expertise carried obligations that transcended job descriptions and social hierarchies. 6 months after graduation, Marcus opened his own veterinary practice specializing in environmental medicine and toxicology. The clinic occupied a converted warehouse space that allowed for both traditional examination rooms and research laboratories, where he could analyze environmental samples for animal health threats. Sterling Dynamics became his first major client, contracting for ongoing environmental assessments of their research partnerships and wildlife habitat management. But the practice quickly expanded to include pet owners dealing with mysterious illnesses, livestock operations concerned about environmental contamination, and wildlife rehabilitation centers seeking expertise in toxicology cases. Victoria continued to bring Luna for regular checkups, though the dog's health remained excellent following her recovery from heavy metal poisoning. These visits served as reminders of how dramatically circumstances could change when knowledge met opportunity at precisely the right moment. Sophia, now 13 and increasingly interested in environmental science, often spent afternoons at the clinic helping with laboratory organization and observing her father's diagnostic work. Her presence reminded Marcus daily that professional fulfillment meant nothing without personal connections that gave purpose to achievement. "Do you ever miss being a groundskeeper?" Sophia asked one afternoon as they organized chemical reagents in the laboratory. Marcus considered the question while watching Luna explore the clinic's examination rooms with obvious comfort. "I miss the simplicity," he admitted. "Gardens don't have medical emergencies or diagnostic mysteries, but they also don't get better when you help them," Sophia observed. "They just grow. Animals actually heal." The insight reflected wisdom that Marcus recognized as fundamentally correct. Groundskeeping had provided satisfying work that supported his family's needs, but it had never engaged the analytical passion that drew him to veterinary medicine. Helping animals recover from illness or preventing environmental threats to animal populations fulfilled something essential about who he was meant to be professionally. Besides, Sophia added with the practical perspective that continued to astound him, "Luna wouldn't have gotten better if you'd stayed invisible." As evening approached and Marcus prepared to close the clinic, he reflected on the unlikely series of events that had transformed his life. Luna's illness had forced him to choose between safety and courage, leading to opportunities that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The journey from groundskeeper to veterinarian hadn't followed any conventional pathway, but it had taught him that expertise could develop in unexpected contexts, and that professional recognition sometimes came to those willing to risk comfortable anonymity for the chance to make meaningful contributions. Most importantly, it had shown Sophia that dreams deferred weren't necessarily dreams denied, that circumstances could change through combinations of preparation, opportunity, and the courage to act when knowledge demanded application. The clinic's security system armed itself automatically as Marcus locked the front door, but he paused on the sidewalk to look back at the building that represented his completed transformation. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new diagnostic challenges, and new opportunities to apply environmental veterinary expertise to problems that traditional medicine might overlook. But tonight, as he drove home through familiar suburban streets with Sophia chattering about her science project and Luna's latest antics, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd finally aligned professional identity with personal purpose. The groundskeeper who'd worked in institutional shadows had become a veterinarian whose expertise could influence policies, save lives, and inspire others to pursue their own deferred dreams. The transformation was complete, but the story continued with each animal whose life was improved through environmental veterinary medicine, each student who learned that expertise could develop through unconventional pathways, and each person who discovered that professional recognition sometimes came to those brave enough to step out of the shadows when knowledge demanded courage. Luna's recovery had been just the beginning. The real victory lay in understanding that expertise without application was merely academic exercise, but knowledge combined with courage could reshape not just individual lives but entire professional possibilities. Marcus had learned to see what others missed, to speak when others remained silent, and to act when action could prevent suffering. In the end, he'd discovered that the most powerful transformations often began with the simplest choice, whether to notice what others overlooked, and whether to care enough to risk comfortable invisibility for the chance to make a difference that mattered. The morning sun cast long shadows across the campus of Sterling Dynamics as Dr. Marcus Rodriguez walked the familiar pathways he'd once maintained as a groundskeeper.
5 years had passed since Luna's collapse changed the trajectory of his life, and today marked a milestone he'd never imagined possible. The bronze plaque beside the main entrance read Rodriguez Environmental Veterinary Research Center, a testament to how far recognition could travel when expertise met opportunity. Sophia, now 18 and preparing for her freshman year at veterinary college, accompanied him on this ceremonial walk. She'd grown into a young woman whose scientific curiosity matched her father's dedication to animal welfare, but her perspective remained refreshingly grounded in practical wisdom that kept Marcus anchored to what truly mattered. "Do you remember exactly where Luna collapsed?" Sophia asked as they approached the courtyard fountain where the crisis had unfolded. Marcus paused beside the marble structure, its gentle spray creating rainbows in the morning light. "Right there," he said, pointing to a spot near the fountain's edge. "She was circling frantically, and then her legs just gave out. And you knew immediately what was wrong." "I suspected neurological toxicity," Marcus replied. "But knowing and proving are different things. The hardest part wasn't diagnosing her condition. It was finding the courage to speak up when everyone expected me to remain invisible." The courtyard had been redesigned since those dramatic events, incorporating native plants that supported local wildlife while maintaining the corporate aesthetic Victoria demanded. But the fountain remained unchanged, a permanent reminder of the moment when Marcus had chosen professional courage over social safety. Victoria emerged from the building carrying Luna, now 11 years old, and moving with the careful dignity of a senior dog who'd survived medical crisis to enjoy comfortable retirement. The golden retriever's coat had silvered around her muzzle, but her eyes remained bright with intelligence and affection for the people who'd saved her life. "Perfect timing," Victoria said, settling Luna gently on the grass where she could explore familiar scents at her own pace. "The dedication ceremony begins in 30 minutes. The Rodriguez Environmental Veterinary Research Center represented a collaboration between Sterling Dynamics, Pacific Northwest Veterinary College, and several wildlife conservation organizations. The facility would conduct research into environmental threats to animal health while training veterinary students in toxicology and ecosystem medicine." Marcus had spent 2 years developing the center's mission and curriculum, drawing on his unique background in both groundskeeping and veterinary medicine to create programs that addressed gaps in traditional veterinary education. Students would learn to recognize environmental health threats while gaining practical experience in diagnostic techniques that could prevent crises like the one Luna had experienced. "Are you nervous about the speech?" Sophia asked, noting her father's thoughtful expression. "Not nervous," Marcus said. "Grateful. This center represents everything I learned from Luna's case about the importance of paying attention to what others might overlook." The dedication ceremony drew an impressive crowd of veterinary professionals, environmental scientists, corporate executives, and government officials interested in the center's innovative approach to animal health research. Marcus found himself surrounded by colleagues who'd once seemed impossibly distant from his professional reach. Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd treated Luna during her toxicity crisis, served as the ceremony's keynote speaker. Her remarks focused on the collaborative nature of modern veterinary medicine and the value of bringing diverse perspectives to diagnostic challenges. 5 years ago, a groundskeeper with incomplete veterinary training noticed symptoms that trained professionals had missed. Dr. Chen told the assembled audience, "That observation led not only to saving one dog's life, but to recognizing patterns of environmental toxicity that threatened animals throughout our region." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, still unaccustomed to public recognition despite his professional success. Sophia reached over and squeezed his hand, her touch providing the same encouragement she'd offered throughout his journey from groundskeeper to veterinary researcher. Dr. Rodriguez's diagnostic insight revealed contaminated pet treats that had sickened dozens of animals across 3 states. Dr. Chen continued. His environmental perspective identified pollution sources that traditional veterinary medicine had failed to recognize. Most importantly, his willingness to speak up despite institutional barriers demonstrated that expertise comes from dedication and observation, not just credentials. When Marcus's turn came to address the audience, he walked to the podium with measured steps that reflected his growth from nervous groundskeeper to confident professional. The faces looking back at him included many who'd supported his unconventional journey, but also representatives of the institutional structures he'd once found intimidating. "This research center exists because one dog got sick," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "But Luna's illness taught me something more important than diagnostic techniques or toxicology protocols. It taught me that knowledge without courage is just academic exercise." He paused, looking toward Sophia and Victoria, who sat with Luna resting peacefully between them. "For years I thought professional expertise required formal credentials and institutional recognition. I maintained gardens while my veterinary knowledge remained dormant, convinced that incomplete education meant permanent disqualification from meaningful contribution." The audience listened with the attentive silence that suggested his words resonated beyond mere ceremonial politeness. Many veterinary professionals struggled with similar doubts about their qualifications, despite possessing knowledge that could improve animal welfare if applied confidently. "Luna's crisis forced me to choose between comfortable invisibility and diagnostic responsibility," Marcus continued. "That choice led to opportunities I'd never imagined, but more importantly, it taught me that animals don't care about our professional insecurities. They need advocates willing to notice their distress and act despite institutional barriers." As applause filled the courtyard, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his understanding of professional identity had evolved. The groundskeeper who'd feared speaking to authority figures had become someone whose environmental expertise influenced policy discussions about animal welfare regulations. But the transformation went deeper than career advancement. Marcus had learned to trust his analytical instincts while maintaining the humility necessary for continued learning. He discovered that expertise required both knowledge and courage, both technical competence and the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom when circumstances demanded fresh perspectives. Following the ceremony,
Marcus and Sophia walked through the research center's laboratories and classrooms, spaces designed to encourage the kind of interdisciplinary thinking that had characterized his approach to Luna's case. Students would learn veterinary medicine while studying environmental science, developing skills necessary to address increasingly complex threats to animal health. Dad, Sophia said as they examined a laboratory equipped for analyzing environmental toxins, "Do you think other people could follow the same path you did?" Marcus considered the question while watching Luna explore the center's grounds with obvious approval. "The specific path probably not," he replied. "But the principle absolutely. Most people possess more expertise than they realize, but they lack confidence to apply their knowledge when it could make a difference." What would you tell someone who wants to pursue deferred dreams but feels too old or too far behind? I'd tell them what Luna taught me, Marcus said, kneeling to scratch behind the dog's ears. Time doesn't eliminate knowledge, and circumstances can change faster than we expect. The question isn't whether you're qualified enough, but whether you care enough to try. Sophia nodded with the serious expression she'd inherited from her mother, combined with the practical wisdom she'd developed through watching her father navigate professional transformation. "I think that's why I want to study environmental veterinary medicine, not just because of what you've accomplished, but because there's so much work still to be done." The observation filled Marcus with pride that extended beyond parental satisfaction. Sophia had chosen her career path not from obligation to continue his legacy, but from genuine passion for addressing environmental threats to animal welfare. Her decision represented the kind of purposeful choice that had driven his own transformation from groundskeeper to veterinary researcher. As evening approached, Marcus found himself alone in his new office at the research center, surrounded by diplomas, awards and photographs documenting his journey from Sterling Dynamics employee to recognized expert in environmental veterinary medicine. The space felt both familiar and surreal, representing professional recognition he'd once thought permanently beyond his reach. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, and Victoria entered carrying a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. "I thought we should properly celebrate the center's opening," she said, setting the items on his desk beside a framed photograph of Luna from her healthier days. "To Luna," Marcus said as they raised their glasses, "and to the unexpected paths that lead to where we're supposed to be." "To courage," Victoria replied, "and to people who notice what others miss." As they sipped champagne and watched the sun set over the research center's grounds, Marcus reflected on the circular nature of his journey. He'd begun as a groundskeeper maintaining Victoria's corporate landscape, invisible to most who passed by but intimately familiar with the rhythms of growth and decay that governed living systems. Now he occupied a position where his environmental perspective could influence veterinary medicine on a national scale, where his diagnostic insights could prevent animal suffering, and where his story could inspire others to pursue deferred dreams despite institutional barriers or personal doubts. "Do you miss the simplicity of groundskeeping?" Victoria asked, echoing Sophia's earlier question. "Sometimes," Marcus admitted. "There's peace in tending plants that don't have medical emergencies or diagnostic mysteries, but I've learned that purpose matters more than simplicity." "And your purpose now?" Marcus looked through his office window toward the courtyard where Luna had collapsed 5 years earlier, the scene that had forced him to choose between professional safety and diagnostic courage. "Teaching others to see what might be overlooked," he said. "Training veterinarians who understand that animal health can't be separated from environmental health." "That's quite a legacy." "Luna's legacy," Marcus corrected. "I just happened to be paying attention when she needed an advocate." Later that evening, Marcus sat in his living room helping Sophia review college preparation materials while Luna dozed peacefully on the couch between them. The domestic tranquility felt earned after years of uncertainty and professional transformation, but it also represented new beginnings as Sophia prepared for her own educational journey. "Dad," Sophia said without looking up from her veterinary school application essays, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about people possessing more expertise than they realize." "What about it?" I think maybe that's the most important thing you learned from Luna's case. Not the diagnostic techniques or the toxicology knowledge, but the understanding that expertise comes from caring enough to pay attention. Marcus smiled at his daughter's insight, recognizing in her words the same analytical clarity that had driven his initial observations about Luna's symptoms. That's exactly right. Knowledge without attention is just information. Attention without courage is just worry. But knowledge, attention, and courage together can change everything. Sophia closed her textbook and turned to face him directly. Is that what you want me to remember about your story? About how you went from groundskeeper to veterinarian? I want you to remember that dreams deferred aren't dreams denied, Marcus replied. That circumstances can change through combinations of preparation, opportunity, and the willingness to act when knowledge demands application. And that sometimes the most important thing you can do is notice what everyone else overlooks. Especially that, Marcus confirmed, reaching over to scratch Luna's ears as the dog shifted contentedly in her sleep. Animals depend on us to see their distress and respond appropriately. But humans depend on each other for the same thing, in different ways. As the evening grew late and Sophia headed to bed, Marcus remained in the living room with Luna, reflecting on the unlikely series of events that had transformed his life. The dog's breathing was steady and peaceful, her recovery complete despite the severity of her toxicity crisis years earlier. Marcus thought about all the animals who would benefit from the research center's work, all the veterinary students who would learn to recognize environmental health threats, and all the people who might find inspiration in his journey from institutional invisibility to professional recognition. But mostly he thought about the simple choice that had started everything, whether to speak up when Luna needed an advocate, despite the social risks and professional uncertainties that speaking involved. That moment of diagnostic courage had opened doors he'd never imagined, leading to opportunities that had seemed impossible just years earlier. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Tomorrow would bring new research projects, new students to mentor, and new opportunities to apply environmental veterinary expertise to problems that traditional medicine might overlook. Marcus had learned to see what others missed, to speak when others remained silent, and to act when action could prevent suffering. Luna stirred in her sleep, her tail twitching with dreams of younger days and endless adventures. Marcus watched her with gratitude that extended beyond veterinary success to encompass the deeper understanding she'd helped him achieve about purpose, courage, and the unexpected ways that lives could intersect to create meaning neither could have found alone. In the end, the story wasn't really about a groundskeeper who became a veterinarian, or even about a dog who survived environmental poisoning. It was about the moment when expertise met courage, when knowledge found its voice, and when someone chose to notice what everyone else had overlooked. That choice had changed everything, not just for Marcus and Luna, but for everyone whose lives had been touched by the recognition that the most important insights often came from the most unexpected sources. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.